Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jessica Lounsbury with the Office of Alumni Engagement here at McMaster. This is our first webinar of our Rejuvenate series of events taking place over the next 2 weeks. This webinar series is designed to help you explore new ideas for the new season. I encourage you to visit our alumni events webpage at alumni.mcmaster.ca/events for a complete listing. If you have a question for our speaker this evening, please type it in using the questions section on your screen, and we will have some time at the end of the formal presentation to answer a few. You will also receive a follow-up email along with the recording of the talk and a short feedback survey following this evening's talk. We kindly ask you take a few minutes to fill out the survey. Now let me introduce our guest speaker this evening. Composer Abigail Richardson-Schulte was born in Oxford, England, and moved to Canada as a child. Ironically, she was diagnosed incurably deaf at the age of 5. Upon moving to Canada, however, her hearing was fully intact within months. Her music has been commissioned and performed by major orchestras, presenters, music festivals, and broadcasters, including Festival Présence in Paris. Abigail won at the prestigious UNESCO International Rostrum of Composers, which resulted with broadcasts in 35 countries. She won the Karen Kaiser Prize, Dora Maver Moore Award for Best New Opera, Quentin Doolittle Award for New Works Calgary, and a Hamilton Arts Award. Abigail is currently composer in residence with the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra, holding the position since 2012, and teaches composition at the University of Toronto. So without further delay, please welcome Abigail.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. So tonight I'm going to be talking about Beethoven. I'll talk about his life for about half an hour, and then we will watch and listen to the first movement of his Symphony No. 8. So first of all, as you heard in that introduction, I was deaf as a child. So Beethoven's story is particularly interesting to me. But my story is really the opposite of Beethoven's. So when I was very young, I had a lot of ear infections, and gradually I couldn't hear, but nobody knew. My parents didn't know, believe it or not. My teachers didn't know, and I had gradually taken over lip reading, really to fit in, and it worked. Now, when my father was asked to move to Canada for work, we all had to go through a medical, and at that point they figured out that I couldn't hear at all, as in one bit, and they denied my family entry because they said I would be a drain on the healthcare system. Well, the company fought back, and if I went to 3 separate specialists and they all declared me clinically deaf with no hope of recovery, well, they would let me in. So that's what happened. I remember going to London and sitting in these, small booths surrounded with buttons, and I had to push the button when I heard something, and I invariably looked out at the doctor, who was shaking his head. No, that did not connect to reality. Well, the very last one was a family friend, and he did some extra research, and the last thing he said to my parents was, "Calgary has a very dry climate. You never know. Good luck." Well, we moved to Calgary, and within 6 months, my hearing just gradually came back. It didn't actually seem like a huge deal because it just gradually trickled in. So it's ironic, that's part of my story, and I became a composer. Anyway, Beethoven, back to Beethoven. People often wonder, how could Beethoven compose when he couldn't hear? But in Beethoven's case, his hearing started disappearing when he was 26, and it actually progressed across years. So I will take you through that journey. So first of all, to start, Beethoven was born in 1770, lived to 1827, and he was born into a family of musicians that had a position at court. So in this time, in Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven's time, it was very typical for composers to have a position at court where they might play in an orchestra, might if they were composers, would write for that orchestra, and they would be expected to provide entertainment to the royals whenever they had guests, etc. And so this was an important part of story for many composers. So for Beethoven, his grandfather was the Kapellmeister at the court of Bonn, and his grandfather was a singer. So it was very unusual that he would be the musician in charge, because that would usually be a keyboard player, potentially a violinist. And now the talent really skipped a generation. Beethoven's father was Not a great musician. He was a tenor and he had a rather stale voice, especially increasingly because he started drinking, which did not help his voice. But he could also play violin and keyboard. But his father knew that young Beethoven was special. And his father knew of the stories of young Mozart, how Mozart's father had taken him around Europe touring, and they had made a lot of money and a lot of fame. And Beethoven's father wondered if that could be the same for his son. So when Beethoven was almost 8, he gave a public recital, and his father told everybody that Beethoven was 6. So believe it or not, Beethoven thought he was 2 years younger than he actually was, well into his adulthood. So anyway, Beethoven, he was a very, very talented boy. But for him, music was difficult because his father was so mean about it. He would make him stand at the keyboard for hours, and Beethoven was often in tears. Well, things got better when Beethoven got a better teacher. It was not his father. And that man was an organist, and his name was Niefe. And he was Beethoven's teacher, we know, when Beethoven was 11. And by the time he was 12, Niefe had granted him assistant organist status. And Beethoven was filling in when Niefe went away, and Beethoven was allowed to play the keyboard in the orchestra. So he was getting a lot of professional experience here at a very young age. And by the way, at this point, he wasn't in school. It was typical in the day that, musicians, certainly people who weren't sort of upper born, would not continue past elementary school. So Beethoven ended his school at age 11. And this haunted him really for his life. He always struggled with punctuation and spelling, and in particular with arithmetic. And the arithmetic was a real problem for him. He often thought people were trying to cheat him because he couldn't figure out the right math, and thought he should have been paid more. So that's an interesting thing for him. Now, as a teenager, he had a lot of experience and was ready for more. So at age 17, he was sent to Vienna to study with Mozart. Mozart had been living in Vienna for the last 10 years of his life, from 1781 to 1791. And he was living as a freelance composer, which was really something special. Mozart ditched the court position and went out on his own. He was writing music and performing and trying to make a go of it, but it was very difficult. So he absolutely would have welcomed Beethoven as a student. We're pretty sure that Beethoven got to study with Mozart a bit because we don't have documentation saying it didn't happen, but we also don't have documentation saying it did happen. Now, very sadly, Beethoven was called back to Bonn after just a couple of weeks with the news that his mother was ill. So he made it back to see her, but she died shortly after of tuberculosis. Now, that's when Beethoven's life started to get really hard because he felt an obligation to look after his 2 younger brothers, because his father had increasingly taken to drink, and especially after his wife died, he turned into a drunk. And Beethoven petitioned the elector, the royal running the court of Bonn, for half of his father's salary so that he could take care of his brothers. So that's exactly what happened. Beethoven turned into this father figure for them from the ages of 17 to 22 and was a court musician at that time. Now, for Beethoven, this was actually a fairly happy time once he got over, figuring out how to take care of his brothers and the financial situation. And part of the reason is that he just got to enjoy being a professional musician and playing in the orchestra. He was playing viola. And his elector was a Freemason and was head of his organization. And so he often traveled up the Rhine by boat and took his orchestra with him for several weeks. And so for Beethoven and his friends, this was just a big party and also a chance to get to meet some aristocrats, that sort of thing. Now, speaking of that, there was a family that was particularly helpful to Beethoven at this time. It was a recently widowed woman and her 4 children. Her name was Frau von Breuning, and she really took Beethoven under her wing. She really acted like his mother. And they were higher born than Beethoven and introduced him to a lot of the right people. This was very important for his career, and how to act. As Beethoven put it too, she knew how to keep the insects off the flowers. And what he was referring to was she recognized when he was, hanging out with unsavory types and just gently gave him a nudge to move on, that they were not for him. So that was certainly important for him. And she also really recognized him as a person. She would say things like, "Oh, he has his raptus again," that he was just so focused, and that was certainly something that stayed with him for his life. An important connection was with Count Waldstein, who became an important friend to Beethoven. And unbeknownst to Beethoven, Count Waldstein was giving the elector money to commission pieces from Beethoven, but Beethoven thought that he was commissioned by his boss, not his friend. And Waldstein then also encouraged and allowed for the situation for Beethoven to move to Vienna at age 22 and study with the great Joseph Haydn. Now, Haydn at this point was the composer. Mozart had just died the year before in 1791. And Haydn, though, was really was sort of the Papa Haydn, they called him, and they credited him with inventing the symphony and the string quartet. He had a long time position working for the Prince of Hungary, Prince Esterhazy. And at that time, at the beginning of his position with the prince, he was treated very much like a servant, had to, wear a uniform and show up twice a day and ask if music was desired. And then by the end of, this 30 years, he, could do anything he wanted. He was very highly esteemed all across Europe by many different aristocrats, and was sought after for the public concert scene, and started to get some of his freedom in publishing. So Beethoven meets Haydn at a time where he has this newfound freedom and an incredible amount of fame. And Haydn had gone through the court of Bonn on his way back from London from a public appearance, and agreed to take Beethoven as a student. So Beethoven moved to Vienna with these tremendous introductions. He was Haydn's student. His elector at Bonn was actually the uncle of the emperor. So that's a big step in the door, foot in the door. And then his friend Count Waldstein was highly connected as well. So everybody was very interested in meeting Beethoven and hearing him and having him at their parties. Now, what were these parties going on in Vienna? At this point, Vienna was absolutely packed with aristocrats. There were 60 dukes. I mean, it was just incredible. And a lot of them wouldn't be living there full time. They would have their country estates that they would come into Vienna for the winter season. And they invariably had music at their houses. This wasn't a public scene, for public concerts with ticket buying audience. No, this was behind closed doors by invitation only. And some of the wealthier houses might have an orchestra, and they would have a few, some paid professionals in there, and the rest would be made up of servants. Actually, if servants could play an instrument and well, they would have their pick of positions across Vienna. And if another family wanted to put on an orchestra concert/event, then they could borrow some servants from another house that could play music. And the servants, of course, liked this because they didn't have to do their household duties, and they could play. And then other households might have a string quartet, for example, or they might have musical parties where they would have guests come and perform. So Beethoven was immediately drafted into this scene, but he also had to study with Haydn, and he had to learn to fit in. So when he went to Vienna, first of all, he rented a piano, he bought firewood, he bought coffee. We know that was very important. And he bought a wig and silk stockings. And he really didn't wear them for very long, though. Soon enough, he threw those away. And, he was quite a different character in looks to Haydn, who was, dressed to the nine with a powdered wig and the silk stocking and the beautiful shoes. No, Beethoven looked like a bit of a country bumpkin in his woolen clothes, and that was just the way it is. But people accepted him because he was quite a character and a marvelous, marvelous musician. So at first, Beethoven was not terribly keen about studying with Haydn, because Haydn, by this point, as I mentioned, was had a huge career, and he didn't have that much time for Beethoven and correcting exercises. So Beethoven struggled a bit and even got another teacher on the sly, and then was soon passed off to another teacher when Haydn was away. But throughout this, though, Haydn did help him. He introduced him to the society there, and he took him to parties and had Beethoven play. And once people heard Beethoven play, well, that was it. They were fans. And a number of people, a number of houses would even set up musical duels. And these were interesting. Mozart had to take part in these too. That's where two musicians, as you can imagine, would have to musically fight each other. They might be given a theme and then have to improvise and make a piece on the spot while everybody was watching. But Beethoven was a little bit different because he didn't entirely play the game. He thought that he was just as good as everybody else, even though he was not an aristocrat. And if they were talking at the party while he was performing, well, he would stop performing and he would get up and leave. So this was shocking at first, but he gradually trained these people to actually honor and respect musicians. I mean, they would certainly respect the very high-ranking musicians, but Beethoven, really told them through his actions what was required. And so he's in a big part responsible for changing the way musicians were ranked in society. In that, deep in the earlier classical period, musicians at the lower level were sort of treated along the lines of servants. But now things were changing and they were sort of gradually turning into like rock stars, like they did in the following period, in the Romantic period. And Beethoven was definitely part of that transition. So those are his circumstances. Yeah, he was really rising in fame. But along the way here in the 1790s, he started to lose his hearing. And this, of course, well, it would have been devastating for him. And he first noted this to a friend. He wrote to some of his non-royal friends and to a doctor and a childhood friend. He wrote, this is in 1801, the trouble is that my evil demon, my health, and by the way, he did have intestinal problems as well, has gotten into my way. What I mean is that my hearing has grown steadily worse for 3 years. It is true that I am stronger and better, only my ears ring and buzz continually day and night. I am living a wretched life. For 2 years, I've avoided almost all social gatherings because it is impossible for me to tell people I am deaf. If I belonged to any other profession, it would be easier. But in my profession, it is an awful situation, the more so because of my enemies, and they are not few. What would they say? I have often cursed my existence. If my condition continues, I will go to you next spring. You could hire a house for me in some pretty place in the country, and for half a year I would be a farmer. This might bring about a change. Resignation, what a wretched refuge, and yet it is the only one open to me. Now, he did tell his royal friends, and I should say that his royal friends were actually friends. He was very honest with them. He didn't really treat them like perhaps they would have been treated by other composers. One of them, he, broke a chair over their head. Another one, this was Prince Lichnowsky, who invited Beethoven into his home, and Beethoven could live there. And when Beethoven called the servant at the same time as Prince Lichnowsky, Lichnowsky would say, "Oh, please go to Beethoven." So Beethoven somehow had power over that. Archduke Rudolph was the highest born of his patrons. He was the emperor's younger brother. And Beethoven was the only one who had permission to go right into his house and go right to the music room because Beethoven was his teacher. This is very interesting. Beethoven was often playing with these royals or teaching them or teaching their daughters. Now, one barrier which could never be broken was that even though they may take him, as their equal in many ways, it would never be with love. So Beethoven taught many royal daughters and fell in love with them, yet could never marry them. Although his friend did write an account to say that in these early years, Beethoven occasionally made a conquest, which would be the envy of many an Adonis. So that's interesting. And another strange thing is that Beethoven often fell in love with married women who could never marry him. So Beethoven's love life is rather complicated. And even though he was going through all of this turmoil with his deafness, he was still falling in love left and right. Now, in 1802, there's a dramatic change, and this is really the end of his first period and the first big moment where he acknowledges his deafness, and because of it, changes his intention, deliberately changes his musical style. There's a letter he wrote to his brothers, which was discovered after his death. It's called the Heiligenstadt Testament, because he wrote it in the town of Heiligenstadt. It was recommended that he move to the country just outside of Vienna for 6 months to heal his hearing. And while he was there, he came to this realization about how he should progress forward. And he even contemplated suicide, but in the end decided no, he needed to live for his art. So it's a fairly lengthy letter. I will read you a pretty good chunk of it because this alone will tell you what it was like to be Beethoven at this time. Remember, this is to his brothers. Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. From childhood on, my heart and soul have been full of the tender feeling of goodwill, and I was ever inclined to accomplish great things. But think that for 6 years now I have been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year, deceived with hopes of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady whose cure may take years or perhaps be impossible. Though born with a fiery, active temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was soon compelled to withdraw myself, to live alone. If at times I tried to forget all this, oh, how harshly I was flung back by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing. Yet it was impossible for me to say to people, speak louder, shout, for I am deaf. How could I possibly admit to an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others, a sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection, a perfection such as few in my profession enjoy or have ever enjoyed. Oh, I cannot do it. Therefore, forgive me when you see me draw back when I would have gladly mingled with you. My misfortune is doubly painful for me because I am bound to be misunderstood. For me, there can be no relaxation with my fellow men, no refined conversations, no mutual exchange of ideas. I must live almost alone, like one who has been banished. I can mix with society only as much as true necessity demands. If I approach near to people, a hot terror seizes upon me, and I fear being exposed to the danger that my condition might be noticed. Thus it has been during the last 6 months which I have spent in the country. By ordering me to spare my hearing as much as possible, my intelligent doctor almost fell in with my own present frame of mind, though sometimes I ran counter to it by yielding my desire for companionship. But what a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing, or someone heard a shepherd singing and again I heard nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that and I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. It seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me. So that marks the end of his first period. And his middle period, he deliberately said that he wasn't satisfied with his works and that now he intended to take a new way. His works in his middle period in his lifetime were generally considered to be the greatest. They were long and involved, and this is generally considered to be his heroic period. Many of the pieces had a struggle in them to be overcome. And also they were more public. So his first works were for sort of for the salon, he did write a couple of symphonies in his first period, but it was mainly chamber music. And then in his middle period, then we have symphonies. We have the symphonies 3 to 8. We have concertos. We have an opera. It's just a very public work. So he did see a lot of success in this time, but he also saw heartbreak. In particular, it was difficult for him financially because he did have a lot of royal backing, like his royal friends would, sort of purchase his pieces. He would dedicate them to them, and then they would give him money. And he could also sell them to publishers. But in 1808, he particularly struggled because a lot of the royals left Vienna, and this was due to Napoleon. And so Beethoven was trying to figure out what to do. And in early 1809, he was offered a court position that he had not had since he was basically a boy, a court position by none other than Napoleon's brother. Well, Beethoven really hated Napoleon. Actually, at first he was very taken by him and he dedicated his Third Symphony to him. But then when he found out that Napoleon declared himself emperor, he ripped up the dedication. So he certainly wouldn't have been that interested in working for Napoleon's brother, but it was a position offered to him for life. And Beethoven was pretty clever. He used it as leverage. So some of his royal friends in Vienna knew he was considering this, and so they banded together, three of them, and offered him a lifetime wage to stay in Vienna and just do what he was doing. He didn't even need to write a certain number of pieces. So this worked for him for a while, but several years later it became difficult because of this war and royal financial problems. Their bank accounts were drained due to this, having to give to the war against Napoleon. And also then one died and didn't leave appropriate notification to his family. In the end, Beethoven did get everything coming to him. The royals honored this agreement, and he always had that money, although it was delayed for a couple of years. Now, in 1810, he fell in love with another woman, his doctor's niece, and intended to marry her, wrote back to Bonn for his birth certificate, and at that point figured out his real age. He wrote the piece for her, Für Elise. A lot of people would just call it Für Elise. That's a well-known piece, but it's actually Für Teresa. It's just the publisher got the name wrong. So even though his hearing was really terrible, like I said, he was still falling in love. And in 1812, he wrote his very well-known Immortal Beloved letter. You may know of that from the movie with Gary Oldman, which, by the way, it just got the person wrong entirely. It was not that he was not in love with Beethoven's sister. He was actually at war with her in the next period, which I will get to. But in 1812, he wrote a letter to most likely a woman by the name of Antony Bretano, who was already married, and declared his love for her. Anyway, it's interesting that he was still so socially engaged at that point, and there were even a number of other women it could have been. Yeah, Beethoven was still socially engaged. Now, also in 1812, there was an interesting moment with his brother. And I'll mention this because this happened at the time when he was writing his Eighth Symphony, which is what we're going to hear in about 10 minutes or so. And Beethoven he was controlling, and he was certainly controlling of his brothers because he felt like he was their father in a way. And his brother was interested in a woman. He was having a relationship with a woman who was unmarried and had a son. And Beethoven was just horrified at this. And so Beethoven actually went to the bishop and the municipality and managed to get a police ban to get this woman kicked out of the town. That's incredible. But his brother was one step ahead, and before the police ban could be officially issued, his brother quickly married this woman. So Beethoven was foiled, and he had a new sister-in-law he hated. There we go. Anyway, these were the dramas of 1812, the situation with his brother and the immortal beloved who he could not be with because of her situation. Now, also in 1812 is a very famous meeting with Goethe. Now, the two of them had known of each other, obviously, and Beethoven had set some text, a story by Goethe, and was anxious to meet him, and the two had a friend in common who facilitated this meeting in the town of Teplitz in 1812. Now, an important part of the story here is that this was when Napoleon was invading Russia, and so a lot of the aristocrats flocked to neutral territory. And Teplitz was one of these places. And so it was just brimming with royals at this time. And so Beethoven and Goethe met, and Goethe found Beethoven to be not very social. He wrote to a friend, "I have met Beethoven's acquaintance. His talent amazes me, but unfortunately he has no self-control whatever. He is no doubt quite right in finding the world detestable, but by behaving as he does, he really does not make it any more pleasant for himself or for others. We must forgive him a great deal, for his hearing is getting very bad. This interferes perhaps less with his musical than with his social side. He is naturally laconic and is becoming even more so as a result of his deafness. Well, the story here is that Beethoven and Goethe were walking arm in arm down the street, perhaps not arm in arm, but they were very close. And suddenly along came a parade of royals, and Beethoven, being Beethoven, walks right in front, walks right through them, makes them stop for him. And they knew exactly who Beethoven was, were very respectful and waved and said hello. And meanwhile, Goethe was on the side, bowing to these aristocrats. And so here we have Goethe on one side of the street, Beethoven on the other, and now all the royals have to go through, and Beethoven waits for Goethe. So finally, Goethe crosses the street after the royals, and Beethoven said, "Why did you wait for them? Why do you care so much about what they think? History will remember us, not them." Well, Beethoven was right, but perhaps he didn't have to be such a jerk about it. But, was that a result of his hearing? He was often just very, very quick to anger. I'll give you an example, actually. When he was, a young man, and while he could still hear relatively well, back in his first period here, he was mentoring a young 17-year-old pianist, and he wrote to the pianist one day, "He is not to come to me again," calling him, in the third person. "He is a treacherous dog, and may the reaper get all treacherous dogs." And then he sends him a follow-up note the next day. "Dearest Natzel," a nickname, "you are an honest fellow, and I see now you were right. Come then to me this afternoon. You'll find Schepansek here also, and the two of us will thump, bump, and shake you to your heart's delight. A kiss from your Beethoven, also called Meerschöbel," which was a type of Viennese dumpling. So I think it was really just in Beethoven's nature to just be quick to anger, but still, definitely the deafness got in the way as well. Now, he could hear still a little bit at the end of this middle period, very, very faintly. He would go to the keyboard and play very low notes, repeated notes on the keyboard, and then say, "Oh, it's beautiful." So that's just a little bit. Now, we go into his late period, which is 1815 until his death in 1827. And this is marked by longer pieces, much longer pieces, very personal pieces, pieces that he wasn't commissioned to write, but he felt the need to write. And they were often more private. So, for example, he spent almost 2 years writing his Hammerklavier Sonata, piano sonata. He did also write public works, though, as well. I mean, he wrote his Symphony number 9, which we will be playing at the HPO on May 4th. And that is the one with the very famous Ode to Joy choral ending. And we've got, over 100 singers on stage for that, too. So that will be very exciting. Generally, this last period, though, is very troubling for Beethoven. So a big part of this is due to his nephew, his other brother, not the brother he tried to prevent marrying his wife, but his other brother had a child and died and gave custody to Beethoven. Now, there was a fight. On the day he died, his brother actually changed the will and gave co-custody of his child, Karl, to Beethoven and his wife. But the issue here is that Beethoven thought that his sister-in-law, Johanna, was a corrupt woman, and he didn't want her to raise his nephew, and so he immediately took her to court, and to the high-level court for aristocrats, because he managed to sneak in there with the name Van Beethoven. And it took them a few years to figure out that he wasn't actually royal, and Van didn't mean royal. Von would have meant royal, and Van sometimes meant royal, but not in Beethoven's case. So then he was kicked out to the lower court, and then, oh, wouldn't you know, but Karl's mother got custody of Karl. So it was back and forth. Karl was very, very troubled. Beethoven was very troubled and needed to make a lot of money as well to support Karl's education at boarding school. So he defined bread works versus real works, and he would take commissions he didn't really want to make money to support Karl. It was very confusing all of the time here that, his hearing was getting worse and worse. He practically couldn't hear at all. He had to converse with his friends with conversation books. We do have those, but we only have one side of it, of course. We just have the friends' questions and comments, not Beethoven's responses. And then he was also using ear trumpets. He would hold like a horn to his ear. I can't imagine those worked, but he used them for a time. Now, other things that happened here related to his hearing. In 1822, he decided to conduct his opera, despite the protests of friends, and he didn't make it very far into the first rehearsal because we have the opera pit with the orchestra, and then we have the singers on stage. And Beethoven's beat was fairly slow, and the orchestra followed his beat because they were right in front of him, but the singers were moving faster, and Beethoven didn't realize that the two didn't connect. And so it absolutely fell apart. And quite quickly, a friend came to him, a very dear friend, and wrote in his conversation book to say, "Stop conducting, more at home." And Beethoven left and never tried again. So that was a very sad moment. We have a happier moment related to his Symphony number 9, and that was in 1824. And it was agreed that Beethoven would give the tempos, would set the speed for the conductor beside him on stage during the premiere. And I should say, too, that at this point, the people of Vienna asked Beethoven to have the premiere of Symphony number 9 in Vienna. At this point, Beethoven was upset with them and thought they only liked Italian opera and was looking to have the premiere in Berlin, but they actually signed a petition and arranged for the performance. So he was delighted with that. Here he is on stage giving the tempos. And when the piece was finished, he didn't realize the reaction behind him. And a singer gently touched his arm and told him to turn around. And the whole place was cheering and on its feet. He couldn't hear them, but he could see them. So that's a very special moment. Now, the last 3 years of his life, he went more internal, started writing string quartets. These are known as the late quartets, and they are amazing. So in this last period, Beethoven became very experimental. He was pushing musical form, doing unusual things. He was writing very emotional and personal music. And like I said, he went back to the sort of the smaller forms generally, the more intimate forms of expression. And it would take him a very long time to write these pieces. In his day, people thought these were his final pieces when he was deaf, and they weren't very good. They sort of discounted them. But it took a while for the music scene to realize that these were the genius pieces, really. And it was Richard Wagner, the composer and conductor, who wrote an essay in 1870, which was the 100th anniversary of Beethoven's death. And he pointed to these late works as being the brilliant ones and saying that they weren't brilliant in spite of Beethoven's deafness, but because of Beethoven's deafness, that this deafness forced him into his own inner world and allowed him to be even more creative. And I'll give you another example of this with the great Haydn, Beethoven's own teacher, who is credited with, forming the string quartet and the symphony. Haydn was out in sort of the middle of nowhere for a while, in the middle of Hungary, and he was, basically forced to be creative. He said, "I discard." Oh, sorry about this. This is a different quote. This is from Beethoven. But Haydn basically said that because he was in the middle of nowhere, he had nobody to criticize him. He had a whole orchestra at his disposal, and he just kept on writing until he got better and better. And this isolation forced him to be more creative. And that's essentially the same thing with Beethoven. Now, Beethoven said about his own composition, he said, "I discard and try again until I am satisfied. Then, however, there begins in my head the development in every direction. And inasmuch as I know exactly what I want, the fundamental idea never deserts me. It arises before me, grows. I see and hear, and the picture in all its extent and dimensions stands before my mind in a single projection. And there remains for me nothing but the labor of writing it down." So that was in 1823, he wrote that. So he didn't need to hear in order to compose because he already knew his musical language inside and out. And many composers write at a desk anyway, not at a piano. But as Beethoven just explained, he sees it, he imagines it all coming together in front of him. He also went for long walks where he was developing the material in his mind and then would come back and then just write it down. Now we are going to watch the first movement of his 8th symphony. And you'll see this is a pandemic performance of us. Everybody's wearing masks. The conductor is our concert master. He usually plays first violin, leader of the orchestra. Now he's conductor in this concert. And Beethoven's Symphony Number 8, as I mentioned, was written back in 1812, in that year where a lot of things happened for him. And this first movement is in what we call sonata form. It is the biggest standard form of music history. And what it is that there's a theme 1 in the home key, and then there's a theme 2 in the neighboring key. And then the two of them mix it all up and go in through all sorts of different keys, and then they both come home to the home key. Now, there are extensions of this. Part of Beethoven's magic is that he extended themes a lot. So there's a lot of music in there. But if you can try to keep track of these themes, maybe you can pay attention for that as they get developed and mixed all around and then come back. The first theme is the very first theme you'll hear. And then the second theme is a happy dancey theme, which is 47 seconds in. It just seems like a new theme. Maybe you'll catch it. But let's watch this. This is the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra performing Beethoven's Symphony Number 8, first movement.
Wonderful. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, we have a couple questions that have come in during the presentation here. But maybe perhaps you could just start off by telling us a little bit how you filmed that piece that we just saw.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was heavily involved in our live streaming program during the pandemic. So I would analyze the scores and work with the video team and call it out live. So we had a camera at the back of the hall that could film sort of across to the upper string section, and then another camera at the other side of the back of the hall that would film across to the lower string section. Then up in the wall, we had a camera that could film down to the winds and the brass and the percussion, and then could sometimes turn around and get a picture of the conductor. And then we had a widescreen shot too. So I was calling it out behind the scenes saying, okay, move to camera 1. All right, camera 3, your next shot is clarinet. All right, now move to camera 2, that kind of thing. So it's very fast moving. It was very exciting. It's an adrenaline rush. So we got better as we went, I think. And yeah, in the end, we made some pretty great videos.
Yeah, it sure sounds like it. Sounds like quite the committee and work to put it all together, especially as you mentioned earlier that it was during COVID times as well. So just having to navigate all that as well, but it was wonderful. Thank you.
Right.
I have a question here. As Beethoven would have lost his ability to hear higher sounds before losing the ability to hear lower notes, did his compositions shift to the use of sounds in lower ranges as he gradually lost his hearing?
That's a good question. In Beethoven's case, no, because he knew the ins and outs and the ranges of each instrument, and he knew exactly where to write them. So it didn't mean that he wanted to write more lower notes, because he was already at that point highly educated, and he wasn't hearing what he wrote. He was hearing it in his head, knowing the way they would sound in each instrument's range, and then writing that down. So that's the difference. But we do have some other interesting examples from music history. I think the best one here is Smetana, who wrote a string quartet called From My Life. It was autobiographical. And for him, he had, the tinnitus, the ringing in his ear, and a very specific pitch. And he actually wrote that into a section. And it's quite a heartbreaking, shocking section. And so, yeah, he actually did detail that in music.
Oh, interesting. Another question just came in here. Do we know what caused the deafness?
They think it was a mixed type, basically like an abnormal growth of the ear bones. It was really nothing that could be fixed, and wasn't as a result of lead poisoning, or there were all sorts of, guesses as to what it was, but it just seems that it was bad luck.
Yeah, okay. To what extent was Beethoven's journey driven by his hearing loss versus his romantic failure? If you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think his career was impacted by his hearing loss, how he interacted with the aristocrats, how he withdrew from society, how he withdrew from performance. He was an active performer, but that had to all stop. But the actual music itself and the composing and the way he composed, interestingly, was not impacted by the hearing loss, because he was completely fully formed as a musician by that point. He certainly would, I mean, he wrote, he didn't write autobiographical pieces, but he couldn't help but put sort of some of his struggles into his music, and, his struggles with the women that couldn't love him back. Obviously that's just a part of his story, and that would go into it. Yeah, he's an interesting figure here of somebody who was able to completely practice his art with this debilitating disability. It really didn't impact the music he wrote.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. And one more question before we sign off for the evening. Perhaps you could touch a little bit on Beethoven's death.
Absolutely. So I brought up Beethoven's nephew, Karl, and how much of a difficult situation that was for Beethoven. They were always fighting. Karl was running away. It was just a very, very tough situation. Now, in 1826, Karl pawned his watch and bought 2 guns, and he shot himself in the head. One of the bullets missed his head completely. The other one hit him, but he survived. So immediately he was, rushed to hospital, and his mother cared for him. She came back in the picture, and Beethoven did feel terrible about this, but they arranged for Karl then to enlist in the army. That was going to be his plan in life, and they seemed to have it resolved, but he still needed time to recover. And so they went off to Beethoven's brother in the country, the one who he had tried to prevent marrying his wife, for Karl to recover. And they did that for several months. Now, when they left to go back to Vienna, they were traveling in an unheated carriage. They stayed at an unheated inn, and Beethoven got pneumonia. And then this was really just the start of his troubles. He also had liver disease. I mentioned that he had abdominal problems, but the liver disease we now know was hepatitis B, because they've been able to analyze his hair samples, and determined he had hepatitis B. And he was also a big drinker. He loved wine. He was drinking, it was at that point probably safer to drink wine than water. And he would have wine every day. And apparently that is just the worst thing for people to do who have hepatitis B. So he had cirrhosis of the liver. It was liver failure. And he just couldn't recover from all of those things at the same time. Interestingly, on his deathbed, the London Philharmonic sent him some money. He was behind on a commission, but instead of giving him a hard time about being late, they sent him money, and he thought that was amazing. Turned out he died with a lot of money. He always claimed that he was poor, but they found a lot of money in his desk, along with letters and pictures and all of that. And then also a publisher sent a crate of wine on his deathbed, and he just said, "Ah, pity, pity, too late." So that's how he died. And they had 20,000 people took to the streets for his funeral, and several days after they performed Mozart's Requiem in his honor. So his death was a huge deal, and he was mourned.
Yeah, very interesting. Actually, I just have one more question quickly come in here, sort of touching on what you were just talking about. Are there any Beethoven kin left in the world?
I don't know about that, actually. Through, yes, distant relatives. I think there have been claims of distant relatives, and then it just wasn't true. So I'm not an expert on that. I don't know. And
Okay.
a lot of things of Beethoven material have been determined to be true, and then they weren't, like even his hair samples, that sort of thing. So it's hard to get the authentic stuff. If you are interested in more Beethoven information and feel like traveling, I haven't been, but the Beethoven House in Bonn is a museum, and they have the incredible Beethoven archives that they started collecting later in the 18th century. They have just many original items, and then they also have digitized their collection as well. So that's something to look at.
Oh, wonderful. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. So that's all the time we have for this evening. I'd like to thank our guest speaker, Abigail, as well as the HPO for joining us this evening and putting on this talk for us, as well as the recorded performance. We really appreciate it. And as Abigail mentioned, on May 4th, Beethoven 9th will be at the First Ontario Concert Hall in Hamilton. If you're more interested in more information or tickets, you can visit hpo.org for more information. Just a reminder to our viewers, there'll be a follow-up email with a survey as well as a link to the recording. If you could take a couple minutes to fill out the survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. Our next Rejuvenate talk is tomorrow evening with Dr. Joshua Koning, where he will discuss his research on why some allergies are lifelong. So if you're interested in attending that and want to register, visit alumni.mcmaster.ca/events, and you can find the event listing there. So Abigail, thank you once again for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our viewers. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.